Take a moment to orient yourself with what you see on the screen. I can help you out by using the cursor. We can see here that we're looking at some sort of dashboard type of report, and where my cursor is, it says Store Sales Overview. We've got 10 new stores, a total of 104 stores, and we have this year's sales by chain. It looks like one chain is called Lindsay's. They've done 6 million. The other chain is the Fashions District chain. They've done 16 million in sales for, I presume, the year. This year is what it says. Now watch what happens in the surrounding graphs and charts if I was to click on this part of the pie chart here. Did you notice how everything else changed? My map changed dynamically. This little graph over here started to change, as well as this one over here. Let's look at something else. I'm now looking at district monthly sales, and what we have here are this year's sales by store number name, and I can actually scroll over any one of these bars in the chart. For example, this one, it says store number name 39, and this year's sales, it appears, is 511,000 or something like that. And we could just scroll over all of them. It looks like that these headers here are not perfect. They're kind of rounding. So I would probably want to remove some of these data labels, but let's forget that for a moment. What happens if we look down here? We see that we've got this year's sales graphed against last year's sales by the month, January, February, March. This black line here represents last year's sales, and the blue line represents this year's sales. If I leave the mouse there, I actually see the data point itself. Pretty useful. But now watch this. Let me go back to the bar chart and go back to store number 39, and let's click on it. And you'll see everything else here dynamically changed. How on earth are we achieving this in real time? The answer is we are using a piece of software called Power BI. This is made by Microsoft, and it actually stands for Microsoft Power Business Intelligence. And it's used to create dynamic dashboards and reports. Now, as I just said, dashboards and reports that are dynamic, like the ones you just saw, are created with Microsoft Power BI. And Microsoft Power BI uses another sort of program or another input mechanism that's known as Power Query. And Power Query doesn't just exist in Microsoft Power BI, it also exists in Microsoft Excel. And in this part of the course, we're going to be taking a look at how to create dashboards and reports using these three different tools. Now, our course assumes that you're pretty comfortable with the Excel basics, including how to make and use a pivot table. Now, if you're uncomfortable with using a pivot table, or if you don't remember how to use the pivot table, that's okay. I'll make sure I post a bunch of materials to help refresh your memory, or if you haven't really done it much before, to get you introduced to the pivot table. But what we are going to focus on is how do we get to the point where we can build dashboards and reports. And to do that, before we get into Microsoft Power BI, I want to make sure that we understand Power Query. So this video will be an introduction to Power Query. And before we can hope to understand what Power Query is all about, we need to go through some key definitions. Specifically, I want to look at data, cleaning data, analyzing it, and interpreting it. Now, data. Whenever you hear me say this word data or data, I'm referring to the raw, unaggregated records and tables. When I talk about cleaning data, I'm talking about data that has been prepared for use, or if we use the word cleaning, and you'll hear that word in industry, we're talking about the process of preparing data for use. Now, what do we mean when we say analyze data? Well, we are talking about examining the data or aggregating the data, and aggregating means applying a function, and you're familiar with this, something like sum, average, count, max, min, product, standard deviation, those sorts of things. We can also look at data and summarize our data, all with the intention to convert it to something that is useful. And once we have it in a useful form, well, then we can interpret our data. And the whole point of doing data analysis is so we can draw conclusions from the information that we have in order to act. And this implies an overall critical path with respect to data analysis. We clean the data, we analyze the data, and we interpret the data so we can make a decision. As I talked about earlier, accountants and data analysts, they will use Excel to do this work, and if they're using Excel, they'll use pivot tables, or they'll use Power Query and something called Power Pivot. Now, a quick note here, Power Pivot is not the same thing as a pivot table. They sound similar, they have many of the exact same qualities, but they are not the same thing. And many accountants and data analysts are adding to their Excel work, they are using something called Power BI, which I showed you at the very beginning of this video. Now, getting to Power Query, why do we like using it so much? Well, accountants like to use Power Query because it can perform three main functions, often called ETL, or extract, transform, and load. When I say Power Query can extract, I mean it can take data and bring it into itself, into Power Query, from files, from a database, from websites, Microsoft Exchange servers, or from another query itself. Power Query can also transform data, and by that I mean we can use this tool to help us clean the data, to reshape the data, remove data we don't need that isn't useful, merge data together, or to append data. We can also use it to generate data as well. And finally, once we're done all of that, Power Query can load our data. Most often, an accountant will load the data back into another Excel table, but it can also be used and loaded into a data model or to some other place. Now, you might be wondering at this point, how do I get it? Well, chances are you already have it. If you go into Excel and you go up to the ribbon and click on the Data tab, then scroll over to the left. You'll see the range of things that we're talking about here. Get data is where we will start, and it might be called get and transform data or something similar to that, but that's where we want to be. Now I think it's a good time that we start to work through some examples. I'll have these spreadsheets also posted for you on the Learning Hub. So let's get to it. Now we're going to import a comma separated value file or a .csv file into Excel using Power Query. But before we do that, I want to show you a little trick or a little something that a colleague of mine showed me once many moons ago. So if we click on this and we go open with Notepad, we can see here that we have a whole bunch of dates. And the dates here are for the year 2023. I know this because this data set was prepared using a date format such where the year is the last two digits. So that's actually 2023 for this data. Let's see what happens if we just try to open it up in Excel straight away. Now, if we open it up in Excel, we can see what's happened here. Excel has gone ahead on its own and tried to convert that data using what it thought was best. And it actually thought that the O1s, instead of representing January, which it did, it thought it represented the year. In other words, Excel is thinking that the data was in a year, 2001, month, February, and then date format, the 23rd of February. But that's not the case. I can tell you that what was meant to happen was the data was meant to be brought in for the month of January, the date in the next column or the next set of digits, and then the year at the end. And if we scroll down a lot further, let's go to like cell 900 or something, we can actually start to see that over time something happens and Excel gets confused and it starts to make a change. Basically, what happens here is we can see that once what Excel thought was the month 12, which was actually the date, once it went to 13, it changed and it didn't know what to do with it. So it just converted it to general, or it looks like text. And this is a problem. So you can imagine just how much work you would have to do to go and convert all of these cells, these 720 something cells above to the correct format, and then all of these cells below. And there's many, many cells below. So how would we go about doing this quicker? That's one of the many things we could use Power Query for. I've opened up a fresh workbook in Excel, and we'll use Power Query now to extract the data from the CSV file and to transform the data all in a few simple, easy steps. Let's take a look. The first thing I want you to do is go to the Data tab at the top of the ribbon, and then from there I'd like you to select Get Data. After that, I'd like you to go and get the file from text or CSV, and then navigate to the appropriate place on your computer to find the file. You click Import. Now you'll see here that we are shown the name of the file, Power Query Example, dates.csv. We are shown the origin of the file, the delimiter or the separator that was used for the data. And if you remember the file from earlier when we looked at it in Notepad, there was a comma in between the transaction date, the account, and the department, and the sum. So it's using a comma delimiter. Power Query is really good at figuring that out, so you might not have to adjust it. And then it gives you some options at the bottom of the screen. It says you can load, you can transform the data, or you can cancel. You should be clicking transform the data because that's what we want to do. We've extracted the data, and you can see already, once again, it's done something on its own with the dates here in the left. So we don't want to load it straight away. We want to transform it first. And this intimidating looking place that you've arrived at now is Power Query. And Power Query's got a bunch of different things going on in it. What I'd like to bring to your attention first is this table looking thing over here on the left. You see it says it's got transaction date, account, department, and sum of amount. Really what's happened here is if we look over on the right where it says applied steps, we can see some of the steps that Power Query has gone through and already done to our data. For example, you can see that it's already applied headers to our data, and it's done that by this step here, promoted headers. It looked at our data and decided it was going to promote what looked like a header to a header. The next thing, and then you see when I click on that, it shows what everything looks like before at that step. So it does these things in order. So the first thing is the source data looks like this. This is the original source data. The next step that Power Query applied was it promoted the headers, and it promoted the headers. And here our dates are still in the original format, you can see. Then it went change type. And when it changed the type, it highlights the column that it changed the type. So it changed our dates to some other format, a format that we know is not correct. So we're going to change that. And we're going to do that first of all by clicking that X and removing that step and going to this column and doing what we want to do with it. So you can right click here and you can go to change type and you can change it to a date. But what we want to do is we want to change it by using a locale. And another way to go about doing that is to click these little letters here, and you can see the option there again, using locale. And the reason I want to do this is, again, something I've learned over time is that you might get data that comes from a different place in a different format. Again, the colleague of mine that gave me this data set, they told me that it was originally US. So we can go and find English US was in that format and we can switch it to date. If we do this, you'll see now that it appropriately recognizes the year for us. That's wonderful. And before we go any further, I think we can take a moment just to change some of the names of our headings. For example, we can just call that date to make it simpler. We have account, we have department, and maybe instead of sum of amount, maybe we just want to call this amount. We also see here that it's going to name the table that ends up getting loaded into Excel. And I don't think I love the name Power Query Example Dates as the name of a table that goes into Excel. We could probably call this something better. So here we have the date, we have 2023, we know we're dealing with January, and transactions. So you could call this transactions, you can call this January transactions perhaps. I think these were sales, so I could just call this 2023 January sales. Even that's not the greatest name for a table, but it's better than what we had before. Now we can go ahead and look to load this in Excel. Some other people are really strict. What they'd want to do is they'd want to make sure that the account type is exactly what they want it to be. So maybe they want it to be a number, or they'd want to force it to be text. Same thing with the department. They might want to force that. And the amount, they might want to set using a locale, or they might just want to set it to currency if they think the currency that they have is fine. Now we can close and load it. When it says close and load, what does that mean? Close means close the Power Query editor. It's going to close this little editor. Load means it's going to put it into Excel. It takes a moment to do that, but now you can see not only has it been brought into Excel, it's been brought in an Excel table format, which is wonderful, right? It's very useful. There are different things we can do with this. You can select different dates, you can sort by date, sort by account, department, or even do some different things with the amount. Now, if you remember from some of your prior courses, if you're in a table, you can summarize the data with a pivot table. It's a quick way to check to see what you have. We'll plunk the pivot table that we're going to create just right over here. That's as good a spot as any. And we could say OK. And you'll remember you have your pivot table fields. So let's take the date column, or excuse me, the date data, and throw that into a row. And we'll have all of the different dates there. We can summarize this further. If you recall, we can group this. That was a right click to group. And we can group it by month. You can group it by year, quarters, hours, days, etc., etc. I think months and years is suitable for this data set. And we can throw some other stuff in there. So we could take, maybe we could put the account column and take the account column and put that as the account data and put that into a column, I mean to say. That doesn't look like it's going to be that helpful. Maybe I can remove that, remove the field, and put the department. Might be more useful. Yeah, it looks better to me. And then maybe the amount as a value. Okay, and then by year we can see January, what the total amount is by each department in our pivot table. Now this next step is kind of tricky, but bear with me, follow the instructions exactly, and you'll see another way that Power Query is actually quite powerful. You'll see available to you, I'll post this file on the Learning Hub for you, Power Query Example 2, dates.csv. We'll quickly open this up with Notepad, and you can see that it's basically all of the January transactions. What's different now, if I keep scrolling, is we get February transactions as well. Now we have the following month's transactions in this file. If we were to download this file and save it over the original file, watch what happens. Oh, there's already a file with that name. So if I remove this one and then give this the exact same name, so I've got to be careful that I do it perfectly. Watch what happens when we go to Excel. So here I am back in Excel, and you'll recall that we have our queries and connections with that one file. If we click on Edit over here on the right, it actually just takes us back to Power Query, and we can see where our source file was. By clicking on the right gear cog, next to that, we can see our file path browse, and that was the file path that we had used. We'll just cancel out of here. If we refresh all, watch what happens. So I had to do two refreshes there. I had to refresh the query, which is the table over here on the left, to include February data. And now we can see we have January and February data loaded into there. And then I had to refresh the pivot table so we could see all of the different amounts by month, by year, by department. And we didn't have to do a whole lot of work in order to get that month in there. Not bad, right? Now, let's say that you have a few different worksheets inside of an Excel workbook. Maybe you have October sales for different stores within the business, the amount of sales revenue for each transaction, and maybe you have different accounts depending on what it is that's being sold. And you have this information for October, November, and December. And what you want to do is you want to put together a summary of that data for the entire quarter. Now, if you just have, let's see here, 14 or so rows of information, you might say, no problem, I'll just copy and paste all of this data into a summary table. Sure, that's fine, you could do that. But what if you wanted to go a step further? Or what if you had a more complicated worksheet? What if instead of 14 or 15 transactions in a month, you had 14 or 1500? It might become quite cumbersome to do copy and paste. You could easily have blank rows in your copy and pasting because you didn't paste in the right spot, or you could accidentally overwrite a few rows when you go to copy paste. That wouldn't be good either. So we can use Power Query to help us do these sorts of functions as well. And we use a function called append to make that happen. If you're inside of a table, you can click from table/range, and it will automatically bring that table into Power Query. Remember, this pane, this editor, is known as Power Query. It's the Power Query editor. And we're looking at the October sales table. Now we can take a moment to make sure that we're happy with the data type for our different columns and what's within. You'll notice also if we look on the right pane here, we don't see the promoted header step that we saw earlier in a different example. And that's because we were bringing a table that already had headers formatted into the table directly into Power Query. So the original source document, if we looked at that, so to speak, already had headers denoted in it. So they didn't need to promote anything that looked like a header to a header. We already had headers. Anyhow, let's just make sure that we're happy with what we're looking at here. I'm happy with this to be text. Or we could just leave it as is as a number. In fact, no, you know what? I think I want that to be text. So let's make it text. Let's say replace current. Say I want this to be text, I'll say replace current. And I want the amount in this situation to be currency. It was sales. We'll say replace current. We don't have to worry about the rest of the formatting here. We see that we have two decimal places as opposed to maybe we don't want decimal places. That's fine. Once we load this into Excel, into an Excel table again, we can deal with the formatting there. Once we're happy with that, remember close and load where we close the Power Query editor and load it into an Excel table? Well, we already have this exact information in an Excel table. We don't need to load it into a table yet again. What we're going to do is click on the down arrow and click Close and Load To. And what we will do when we get here, you'll see this Import Data dialog box. And all we want to do at this point is we don't want to import it into a table, nor a report, or a pivot chart. We just want to create a connection. Let's keep going. You'll see that connection is created there, but it did not actually create another table anywhere, which is good. Now we can move over to the November tab. And again, I've simplified this with just a few rows, but imagine if you had hundreds or thousands of rows, this will be useful. So we click anywhere into the table. And once we are clicked inside of the table, and just to confirm with everyone, we are clicked in the November table. So once we click anywhere in the table, once again, you can say from table range, right? Under data, get and transform data, we're going to use this option, from the table or range. It once again loads up this editor view, and we've got our November sales here. I'll make these changes just for the sake of showing you. We can replace current. And when you make these sorts of changes, remember over on the right-hand pane, it keeps track of the fact that you changed the type. And that can be a useful way to sort of keep track of some of the changes that you're making. Anyhow, now we've got our November table set up, but we don't need to load it to a table. What we want to do is load it to something called a connection. We'll say OK. And over here on our queries and connections pane, we can see we have October sales. It's going to look like that. And we have November sales, which is going to look like this. Now let's say we want to put some of our tables together. And again, one more time, just imagine that you have many, many more rows than we have here. Let's go over, and as soon as you mouse over any of your queries, you'll see that you get this little preview pane of what things would look like if you were to load them into their own table. What I want you to do is just to right click and then scroll down to where it says Append. If you click on Append, it says, do you want to combine these rows, concatenate the rows from two tables into a single table, two tables, or three or more tables? Let's say even though we know we want to do three or more tables, let's say we make a mistake on purpose. We only do two tables for whatever reason. The first table is going to be October sales. The second table will be November sales. And we say OK. It takes us over here. And once again, we have a new query that's developed. And this query can be loaded into a table. It's going to name it Append1. I don't really know what that means, so let's just call it something else. Let's just call it Q4 sales. And we can close and load to. Or excuse me, in this case, we could just, well, yeah, we could close and load to. And maybe what we'll do is we'll put it into an existing worksheet. And that existing worksheet can be over here. Order summary. And I can say OK. And here's our table. When we go to quarter summary, I can click on this. We'll see that we now have a table called Q4 sales, and that's all of this data here. Now you might be thinking, okay, I can go ahead and figure out how to append December to this table, but it's not quite as straightforward as you think. The first step is, you'll notice here when we go to queries and connections, we have a query for October sales and November sales, and those were connections only, as opposed to the rows that were loaded when we actually loaded a separate query into Excel. We just had a connection and a connection for October and November. We can quickly create a connection for our December figures as well. Let's go to data. After we've clicked on the December tab, we can go from table range. This loads up as follows. For whatever reason, I decided to change these to text, so we'll just keep doing that to be consistent. I think really I just wanted to remind you that you can change the type of the data when you're at this Power Query editor screen. This one here we were going to call currency. Okay, so here we are. We have all of that information. I was clicking replace. You'll notice we could have just clicked add new step, and that would have given us an even better audit trail over here on the right. But I just did it this way. Here we have it. We'll go close and load to, and we'll just make this only create a connection. And now we have all of this stuff here. We've got October sales, November sales, Q4 sales, and December sales being a connection only. Now, a lot of people would think the thing to do would be to right click on this and try to append December sales to Q4 sales. But that won't work nearly as well as you think. It actually won't work. What you want to do is go to Q4 sales and edit this query. Once you're here, you have different options in order to add December sales. I think the easiest option might just be to go append queries. If we do this, we know that we already have two tables put together here, and you just want to, and now you've got essentially one table. You're just looking to add one more. And so what you would do is you would just go and add December sales to the table that you've already got there. You can click OK, and we've appended that as follows. I can go close and load, and you'll notice I don't have another option. We've already set the way that this particular query, Q4 sales, is going to load. So the only option I have is close and load. I can click on that, and there you go. We've now added all of the December stuff. We could make this more useful for a user by adding a pivot table. Again, I could click into the table, and if you click on the Table Design tab, you have the option to summarize with the pivot table. The table that I want to summarize with the pivot table is Q4 sales. We can just put the report right over here somewhere where I can see it easily and say OK. Now I've got different options of what I can do here. And pivot tables, if you remember, opens up a pane on the far right, pivot table fields. And these are pretty powerful things. For example, I could just see each account. I'll click there and make sure it goes into rows, which it did. And I could see the amount for each account. That's somewhat useful. Maybe we want another layer of granularity, so we could put in the store. And now we can see for each revenue account, whatever they mean, how much of that is being generated by each store. Or you might want to look at this differently. You might want to take a look at overall store performance. And so I can just put store on top, and now we're sorted by store. Now, of course, one way that this table would have been a lot more useful to a user is if the original data in each of the data rows, if they actually contained a date, which they don't in any of these tables. And you can see that our overall report is now hurting. We can maybe see how much we're making by store, or I showed you we could pivot it and we can see how much we're making for a particular sales account, for maybe their different products or whatever it is that's being tracked. But we can't see how much is being generated by month, at least not quickly. So we have a summary for the quarter, which I think was the original intent, but if we wanted more granularity, how much was sold in October versus November versus December, we can't easily see that. And the main reason for that is the original data was only so good.
The last part of this video covers an advanced topic that is not examinable, so you can stop here if you wish.
Now, hopefully it's obvious that it would be better for if this information had some indication of month or date. And even though we don't have the date by day, which would be best, and we would expect nowadays to have that kind of information, we don't have it based on what was given here. So let's see if we can fix that. Now, what I'm about to do It's a useful little trick to know. I won't examine it, so no need to get stressed, but I do want to make sure that we review some of these fundamental data cleansing and preparation ideas. So let's go ahead and try to figure out how we can go and maybe recreate a table like this and make another pivot table, but that has the month information in it. To do that, we're going to go and get data, and we're going to go from other sources, and we're going to do something called a blank query. And a blank query is an opportunity for you to do some formula work in Power Query. Again, I don't see myself examining this, but I'd like you to have some experience or exposure to it. So if you don't even see the formula bar when you're in the Power Query editor, just go to View and make sure the formula bar is selected. I can already see mine here, so I'm going to go ahead and type in a formula. Now, the formulas in Power Query are text and case sensitive, so you have to do it exact. It's equal capital E for Excel. And then you should have a few different options that come up, and the one that we're going to use is Excel dot capital C for current, then capital W for workbook. We'll do that, and we'll just use regular brackets, open and closed. What this will do when I push enter, and I'll do that now, is it will return all of the different tables and elements that we have in our entire workbook. You can see that if I click over here, you can see that table in each of these tables that we've created is in green. If I was to click on one, it would actually expand and take us in depth to look at the table itself, which we don't really want to do. So let's go back here and look at our blank query. Oh, and if you didn't catch how I got back, I'll just do that again. So let me just click on one of these green tables. Uh, and it takes us to the actual table itself. And now you might be looking at Power Query Editor and you're like, how do I get back to where I want it to be? Just over here on the right, we're dealing with query 1. That's the name of the blank query we're creating. We can come up with a better name for that in a bit. What I'll do is we'll just call it Q4 sales summary, a little bit of a different name from what we used before. And what we're going to do here is we're going to just delete those steps, and it brings us back to where we were. Now, taking a look at this, we can see that we've got our table for October sales, November sales, and December sales. And we have that Q4 sales summary, or sorry, just Q4 sales that we put together, but I wasn't totally happy with. We didn't have any date information in it. What can we do? Well, we can click on this down arrow and we can just deselect Q4 sales. And that's a pretty good start. Now we've got the different tables and we've got October sales, November sales, and December sales. But with the way these tables were worded, we don't actually have this as a date of any kind. So we've got to do some work here to kind of massage the words to turn them into dates. And what we can do is we can right click and say replace values. And what we want to do is we want to replace the word sales, which each of those, and we'll replace it with a space, 1, comma, space. That should work. And here we have October 1st, November 1st, and December 1st. Still not great, not exactly what we want. So we can go to the top where it says transform. So notice the mouse, I'm taking it to the top of the Power Query Editor ribbon. I'm clicking transform and I'm going to date. It's now converted the dates and it's given it some weird year, which again is not perfect, but we just wanted to display the month because the years that we used in this spreadsheet were not even proper years. It's 20XY, 20XY, 20XY. So we can go back to this once again, click on month, and just say, give us just the name of the month. And that's not bad. Now we're getting somewhere. What we can do next is we can click on Content, and you'll see we've got a few different options here. We're going to expand this, and we don't want to use the original column name as a prefix. What will happen is it will say content dot, November, content dot October. We don't want that to happen. So we'll deselect that, and we'll say load more, just in case there was any other information that wasn't there. Okay, now let's expand all of this. And you'll see what happens by expanding is we get all of the original information in each table, and now we have the month next to all of the data or each transaction from a given month. All we need to do now is be consistent with our type, our data type. So I'll turn these into text, turn this into currency. And again, because we weren't able to put proper dates in here with a month, day, year kind of thing, we're going to leave this as text. Now we can go ahead, go back to the top of the ribbon in Power Query Editor, click on Home, and we can say Close and Load, and we'll close and load it, perhaps to a new worksheet. So we'll just do this. And here we are. Once again, we have our data. I'm not too happy with the formatting here. Let's go back to this row. So here I am, and it looks to me like I've made 2 more errors yet again. We've got a bunch of extra data loading up in this table that doesn't have any name against it, and I didn't quite format the amount correctly. So what's going on here? Let's go back to our query to edit it. You'll even see here it says 85 rows loaded now and 43 errors. What's going on? We'll right click to edit and go back. Let's go back up to source of the applied steps, and we'll refresh this preview. And let's take a look at what happened. Remember, originally we had the Q4 sales. That was the original time when we did this, and I didn't have any of the months in there. So we removed that, and sure enough, next step, filtered rows, it's gone. But look, there's this new thing called Q4 sales summary. That's the query we just made. And because we just made that query and loaded it into Excel, the first step, the source step, was to get all of the tables from the current workbook. We basically created, unintentionally, this circular reference, which is a problem, right? So how do we go about getting rid of it? Under filtered rows, we could go back and just remove the Q4 sales summary so it's not part of this. Let's see if everything sort of looks good now. Once we change type over here, I wasn't happy that I didn't set that to currency, so I'll set that to currency there. We could add that as a new step. So we have an audit roll, and let's close and load. Okay, now we've got 42 rows loaded. There are no errors, and the information looks a lot better than it did before, at least. So now we can go over here, we can go to table design. We could summarize this with a pivot table. We want to summarize this table here. Let's just put it here on the existing worksheet. We'll just plop it over there. And now we can maybe see this column name I should have renamed that as month, but anyways, it's name. And we could say the account by month, store as well, and then the amount would just click over there on the right. And now we've got something that looks pretty useful to me if we want to do it on a monthly basis. You might prefer to have a bit more detail, and maybe you want the store over in a column. And that might help you even better. Now you can see each store by each month. And then if you want a breakdown of accounts, you could just do that. Okay, so that was really detailed. I would never examine you on figuring out how to do this component, over here, but I thought I would show that to you in case you ever encountered it in your career.